Well, as I mentioned before we started the show, we have a guest in studio today, Tom Giovanetti. I'm going to introduce him in just a moment here. He is the president of IPI, which is based here in Dallas, Institute of Policy Innovation, or for Policy Innovation. They're a public policy research organization. I want to urge you to go to their website, ipi.org. I do it almost every day because it's always filled with interesting position papers. They're not so lengthy that you won't read them. They're serious, focused on one subject, well-reasoned, just a great source of public policy thinking. Tom Giovanetti's background includes he has been part of joining IPI in 1992, a freelance policy writer. He worked for a small manufacturing company where it ultimately led him, in addition to what his job was, it gave him real-world experience in how taxes and regulations affect small business. Tom Giovanetti is nationally known. He's published in Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Investors Business Daily. He represents IPI to many national and even international organizations. And he's just a great guest to have on the show. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Debbie. Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. Well, the reason I mentioned I wanted to have you come on, you gave a speech not too long ago in Texas to a Republican women's group, but the speech was focused on the idea about judicial supremacy. The basic concept being we have come to just accept in America that the final word on almost any issue, the final word is whatever the Supreme Court says that it is. And so we have, for example, Congress, the courts, the legislatures, everyone, the executive branch just surrenders once the Supreme Court has spoken and said, well, that's our system. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter. And you are challenging that idea, and many people are, but you wrote eloquently about it. I want to ask you about it. Why are you challenging this idea of the Supreme Court having ultimate judicial supremacy?
Well, it's not just the Supreme Court, it's the whole judicial branch. I mean, think about what we have seen in recent months. We have literally seen mid-level judges in Washington State, in Hawaii, issue injunctions that tied the hand of the President of the United States.
Yep.
So it's not just the Supreme Court, it's the idea that the judicial branch and judges are supreme over states, over legislatures, and over Congress. This idea of judicial supremacy, if we were to poll your listeners on this, I think 99% of your viewers and listeners would say yes, the courts are supposed to be the ultimate arbiters of whether something is constitutional or not, or whether it's legal or not. The problem is, if you actually study civics, and if you actually read the Federalist Papers, and if you read the Constitution, you find out that's not the case. Now, I think everybody more or less understands this idea that we have these three co-equal branches of government. I think everybody kind of understands the idea of checks and balances. But we need to remember why we have those checks and balances, and that's because our founders, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, the people who wrote the Constitution, they were determined that the American people would not be ruled. There's a difference between being ruled by someone and self-government. And we were designed to be a system of self-government, to where we would determine for ourselves the rules we operated under. We would not have rules imposed on us by someone else. And so that's why they took the federal government and they broke it up into three pieces. And in our system, there has to be consensus among the three branches in order for something to happen. That's why, for instance, Congress passes laws, but the president has to sign them or veto them. That's why Congress can impeach a president, but who presides over the impeachment trial? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You have all these different devices to where one branch cannot by itself do anything. In our original design, a branch of government cannot impose its will on the American people. You have to have consensus. But even before we get to the three co-equal branches of government, you have the states. Mm-hmm. And remember, the states created the federal government. The states are the first check on federal power. In the 9th and 10th Amendment, the states reserved all of this power to the states, right? So we don't just have the three co-equal branches of government that are checks on power. We also have a fourth player, which is the states themselves. Okay, and that's how our system is designed to work, and that is how our system basically worked until the 1950s, when you had the Warren Court, this very activist, liberal, progressive Supreme Court. And in a series of court decisions, the Warren Court proclaimed itself supreme over the other branches of government. Which isn't that convenient? That you just declare yourself to be supreme. Yeah. Up until that point, that is not how it worked. And so what we've been operating under since the 50s is this idea of judicial supremacy, that, Congress can do things, the executive branch can do things, the state can do things, but really you're just play acting. Really you're just pretending, because nothing you do actually matters unless the courts say it's okay or not. And that's how we operate. That's how everyone thinks the system is supposed to work, but that is a fundamental betrayal of our constitutional design.
That was an extraordinary summary. I just loved it. I want to go right to your point about the states, to start with the idea of the states. You wrote an art, and by the way, again, people should go to IPI.org. There's a summary here called Notes from TFRW Talk Against Judicial Supremacy. A lot of the points we'll talk about today are summarized there. You should read them so you can repeat them to your friends. Tell your 25 best friends how important these ideas are. But you basically say our problem, we've got off track with checks and balances, is the states have abrogated their duty to the first and best check against the federal government, which 9th and 10th Amendment. And secondly, the courts have asserted a completely unconstitutional doctrine of judicial supremacy. So what is it? You talk about the 9th and 10th Amendments, and basically I think everybody knows, but the 9th Amendment has the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So you still have the rights you have, they've been set, that are yours. And then the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the U.S. government by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively. So what does that mean that the states should be able to do? I mean, in what way could the states assert this power again?
Sure, absolutely. By the way, there's a really important distinction in what you just read that I think people miss all the time. We as conservatives, constitutionalists, free marketers, whatever you call yourself, we should never use the phrase states' rights.
Yeah.
Never. We should never use the phrase states' rights. In our Constitution, people have rights. Government doesn't have rights in our Constitution. People have rights. Government has powers. So the 9th and 10th Amendment, they talk about the rights of the people, but then they talk about the powers of government. And the idea is, remember, it was the states who wrote the Constitution, right? Because there was no country yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So you would think, I mean, whoever was writing the Constitution, they were going to reserve a lot of power for themselves, right? That just makes sense. So that's what the states did. So what the states said is, we are at the top of the power pyramid here, okay? Washington is not at the top. The states are at the top. And we create the federal government and we delegate certain powers to it. We also, by the way, create our own municipalities. We create counties and cities and we give them powers. But any power we've not delegated to the federal government or to the cities, we retain at the state level. So in our constitutional design, the states are supposed to have really more power than any other level of government. So that's why I said earlier, the states are the first check to make sure that we're not being ruled from Washington, D.C. But then, of course, you have the three branches of government. And if you study political science, most political scientists will tell you, yes, they're more or less co-equal branches of government, but if you really look at the powers that are assigned, the Constitution intends the legislature to be slightly more powerful than the other two.
I was going to make that
right?
point, yep.
The most representative, most democratic body.
Tied to the people.
Right, the one that is closest to the people. Now, the founders were afraid of the people going crazy. That's part of why they did these checks and balances. The founders really didn't trust pure democracy. They didn't want us to be a pure democracy.
Right.
They wanted us to be a republic. But the branch of government that is supposed to have slightly more power than the other two is the legislature. But the founders were particularly concerned about one aspect of their design. They looked at their design and they said, the thing that could really go wrong here is that the judicial branch could gain too much power. They knew that was the fatal problem. And so there was a debate in the Constitution about how much power do we give the judicial branch? And there was a specific decision made: we will not give the courts the power to enforce their own decisions. This is not an accidental omission. If you've ever had to sue anybody at small claims court, right, you find this out. It's easy to get a judgment, but it can be hard to collect because the courts don't have the power to enforce. And one of my favorite quotes, if I can read it,
please do.
This is in Federalist 78. This is from Alexander Hamilton. He says, "The judicial branch has neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive arm even for the efficacy of its judgments." After all, think about it. What do we call court decisions? We call them opinions. We call them judgments. But the courts have been purposely deprived of the power to enforce their decisions.
By the founders.
By
intentionally.
The founders. It is intentional and it is explicit because the court, the judicial branch, is the branch that is the most distant from the people.
Right.
Right? So they had to make sure that the most distant branch from the people did not accumulate more power. But unfortunately, that is exactly what's happened. And my argument is that we are now a ruled people. We are no longer a self-governing people. We are ruled by appointed judges in black robes who are not accountable to the people and who have lifetime appointments. Now, the problem is not that they're appointed. The problem is not that they have lifetime appointments. The problem is not that we have judges. The problem is that all of the other players in the consensus mix, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the states, have thrown up their hands and they have yielded to this assertion of judicial supremacy. They've been happy for it to happen because it absolves them of responsibility.
Oh, it absolves them of responsibility. And I have to tell you, there's a little bit of a hint. What you're saying, I've been reading a lot about this. I completely agree that you're right. But it has a little sense of a feel of uncertainty about it, because if there's not one final branch we're agreeing is the final decider,
right,
you have that edginess of three co-equal branches of government.
Right.
And what do you do when there's a conflict? For example, the most recent battle we had, or one of the recent battles, was in Washington in the Supreme Court. There was a question of whether or not the Trump administration could put on the census, it is the executive branch's job to send the census out.
Right.
They wanted to put the citizenship question on, and the Supreme Court, in a very squirrely, undefensible, in my opinion, delayed it. They sent it back down to a lower court, making it impossible to get the question on the census in the
right,
time to go to the printer.
Right.
Many people were saying, why doesn't the Commerce Department just go ahead and send it out with the question on, because the Supreme Court really shouldn't have authority to make that decision. What's your take on that?
We will not drain the swamp until we start defying improper court orders. We will not. Now, this really shakes people up. When I give this
right,
talk and I talk about ignoring courts and defying courts, people say, oh, they start shaking. That would be some sort of a constitutional crisis. No, that's how our system is designed to work. And when you were talking about earlier, this sort of tension or uneasiness that would come from not having a final authority, in our system, we're supposed to tolerate that tension. Because, again, we're not supposed to be a ruled people where there is a final authority. We are supposed to be a self-governing people. So my argument is that states should understand. And by the way, if you've ever taken an oath of office at the state level,
yeah,
in Congress, in the executive branch, you take the same oath to the Constitution that judges do. Okay? Every branch of government has an equal responsibility to interpret the Constitution. It is not left to the judicial branch. And states have an equal obligation to interpret the Constitution. It is not the provision, it is not the exclusive domain of the judicial branch to interpret and apply the Constitution. And the judicial branch gets it wrong.
They do, and they give themselves power.
Who did the Dred Scott decision?
Right.
Was the court right?
Correct.
When it declared that African Americans only counted as 2/3 human beings? Of course not. Courts get it wrong all the time. So where do we get this idea somehow that courts, when you promote someone to a court, suddenly their brain becomes 3 times larger and they become 10 times wiser?
Well, on top of that, so many of the extremely controversial decisions that really is leftism that has been able to get many of their policies they could not get passed by an elected legislature got put in place by courts, and often in 5-4 decisions. And 5-4 decisions, we're talking about 5 people in robes ruling the nation.
If you think back on the most controversial things that have happened in the 20th century politically,
yes,
every one of them was imposed on us by courts. Not just Roe v. Wade. Forced busing, the Democrats have suddenly started talking about busing again.
Yeah.
Forced busing was imposed.
Parent school.
Gay marriage was imposed. Again, it doesn't matter what your view of gay marriage is, right?
Right.
But it should not have been imposed on people from courts. Remember, the most progressive state in the country, California, within the last 15 years, the people of California had a referendum on gay marriage, and they voted against it.
Right.
And a court threw it out. A court just flicked it away. No, you can't have that. It doesn't matter that it was done properly. It doesn't matter that it was done constitutionally under the California Constitution. A court just overruled it. The most controversial, the most socially jarring things that have happened in this country have all been imposed by the courts. They've not come through the normal process of consensus that our system is designed with.
One point you make in the editorial you had, I think it was in your editorial in the Dallas Morning News, was a point that no wonder the nominations for federal courts, district and the circuit courts and the Supreme Court have become the most contentious of almost anything in Washington, because people are realizing ultimately whoever sits in those courts, given if we can continue to salute the judicial branch, they're going to run the country. And so it's really going to matter, every single person on those courts.
We have given them absolute power. We have made them into demigods who rule over us. So it's no wonder those are the biggest political knockdown dragouts.
Yes.
Yeah. And now, as a conservative, okay, I would rather conservatism in general be the dominant theory on the Supreme Court than progressivism. So I like it when my side has some control over the court. But that's not the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is to take the court down a couple notches. And as long as until we're willing to do that, we will continue to be ruled by these pendulum 5-4 swings. You know, one 80-year-old judge on a court making these decisions.
Yes.
I mean, it's absurd. Our founders would choke. Our founders would choke on the idea that a president of the United States, I mean, let's think about President Trump's immigration order restricting immigration from 7 dangerous countries, okay?
Yes.
That process was all done by the preceding administration. It was all done by the Obama administration. So an administration goes through the process of determining how can we keep dangerous people out. An administration decides these 7 countries are the sources of most of the dangerous people. The next administration says, okay, well then we will limit immigration from those dangerous countries, right? This is all done properly. This is all done constitutionally. And one mid-level judge on the West Coast thinks he has the power to issue a nationwide injunction that ties the hands of the entire executive branch. It's absurd. Our founders would roll over in their graves at that idea, but we just passively accept it.
I want to hit 2 things. There's so many ways to go with this, and it's a huge topic, so I hope to have you back sometime in the fall to explore more of them. But one thing, I mentioned earlier how it's a little bit jarring to people to think, well, if the Supreme Court isn't the final arbiter, then we're just kind of lost. But the truth is, in fact, there's a great writer, Daniel Horowitz, at Conservative Review, who said, if there's any one entity up here, it's the Constitution. It's what the Constitution itself says, and all of us have to be responsible to read it, understand it, and be able to argue it. So I love that thought that we're not lost in chaos. We're actually rooted in the Constitution.
That's not called chaos. That's called freedom. That's called liberty.
Yes, I love that. Love that. Yep. I want to get around to what we do about it, because this is the point you're making, and others during the dispute about whether or not to send the census out with the question in it about citizenship, even given the Supreme Court. There were people making your point about why are we agreeing that the Supreme Court has this judicial supremacy, but I think it'd be there aren't enough people in America alert to this problem you're describing, and so it would seem lawless, and frankly, even to some judges and lawyers, it would seem lawless that you can't have the Commerce Department go ahead and sending out the question. The court said you couldn't do it. But I want to get to some ways that we can, because you have to, if you're alert to this, we have to find ways to bring about public awareness. And then to do the challenge to it. And some of the ways that people talk about involve having Congress take more of a role in describing what jurisdiction the federal courts have.
But Congress won't do it. I mean, Congress is not the answer. And here's why. Why. What has happened is Congress has figured out that by deferring to the judicial branch, it absolves them of responsibility. So they don't.
So they like this.
And the executive branch likes it. And the states like it. I mean, what has happened is we now have this toxic mix where all of the other players in this consensus design, they're quite happy to continue to get reelected and continue to go on television and give interviews, but yet let the courts have all the responsibility, because the courts don't have to get reelected. See, I have to get reelected. So if I can find some way to shove my responsibility off to an unaccountable branch of government that never has to face the voters, that's kind of a sweet deal for me.
Okay, so what is the answer? What do we do to push back against this, to bring back judicial supremacy or take it away from the federal
The answer
courts?
is we need a few educated, enlightened elected officials, and it's more likely than not to be governors, although it could be a president, to simply defy court decisions that are inappropriate. I mean literally defy it. I mean literally when the state of Alabama passes restrictions on abortions, and it properly goes through the Alabama legislature, and it is properly signed by the governor of Alabama. It's all been done properly through the proper design. And then the Supreme Court ultimately says, no, you can't have that. I hope you enjoyed playing at being a government, but you're really just playing at it because we retain the authority. When the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that, what the state of Alabama should do is they should issue a declaration. And they could say, thank you very much, Supreme Court, for your opinion.
For your 2 cents.
Thank you for your input, but we are going to continue doing exactly what we say we're going to do. That's what should happen. Now, game it out. What happens?
Yeah.
What happens, really? What does the Supreme Court do then? They can't do anything. Okay? Now, if Congress and the executive branch both together thought that a state had gone rogue, there are things they could do. They could cut off transportation funding to the state of Alabama. They could cut off education funding. But do you think they're going to do that? Do you think senators from the other states that are also trying to restrict abortion would go along with that? Let me predict what would happen if Alabama defied the Supreme Court. Nothing would happen. Nothing would happen except that all the cable news shows would be 24 hours a day about the constitutional crisis. They'd all be talking about the constitutional crisis. It would not be a constitutional crisis. It would be a reassertion of the powers of the states, and it would be taking the courts down a notch. Now remember, the Supreme Court has been defied before. Okay, during the Civil War, Congress passed something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act told the northern states, you have to return runaway slaves. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, this is constitutional. And Massachusetts and Wisconsin and several other states passed resolutions, and they said, we will not abide by this decision. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing. They ignored the Supreme Court, and nothing happened. There are 6 or 8 different times in American history where Supreme Court decisions have been ignored, either by the president or by the states, and nothing has happened because that is proper. That is not a constitutional crisis. That is proper. And I hope I live long enough to see a governor or a state legislature or a president say to the Supreme Court, thank you very much for your opinion. We have taken it under advisement, and we have decided to proceed anyway. That, Debbie, is how our system's designed to work. Not judicial supremacy, not the tyranny of the judicial branch over all of the other levels of government.
Tom Giovanetti, I love this topic. I am going to invite you back in the fall because I have about 25 more questions. But quickly, if you could tell our listeners, your IPI is IPI.org. You want to say a bit about IPI and what you do and what people can learn there?
Sure. We're a 32-year-old free market conservative think tank. We're based in Dallas, Texas. We're purposely based in Texas. We don't want to be in D.C. That's where most of the think tanks are. But we like being 1,000 miles away from Washington. We think that protects us from sort of getting caught up in politics and caught up in the game. We're a nonprofit organization, so donations are tax deductible, and if folks want to support our work, we love them for doing that. All of our materials are free. This judicial supremacy topic is sort of a pet topic of mine. It's not something that IPI has done a lot of work on, but you will find a dozen or more resources on our website on this topic, as well as on other topics like taxes and healthcare and technology policy and things like that.
I will, again, to our listeners, I'll tell you that the reason I love going to this website is because everything is very clearly written. Even if you're not a policy wonk like I can sometimes be, you can follow the arguments. They're very clearly written, and they hit one topic well. And you feel like, I understand that. I can repeat that. So
we try to write for regular people.
I appreciate that very much. Okay, and thank you so much for being here today. I loved having you.
Great.